What's everyone's thoughts on what's happening in Afghanistan? Serious. Attention, serious. Tag notice, jokes, puns, and off-topic comments are not permitted in any comment, parent or child. Parent comments that aren't from the target group will be removed, along with their child replies. Report comments that violate these rules. Posts that have few relevant answers within the first hour, and posts that are not appropriate for the serious tag will be removed. Consider doing an AMA request instead. Thanks for your cooperation and enjoy the discussion. I am a bot, and this action was performed automatically. Please contact the moderators of this subreddit if you have any questions or concerns. I'm sure many people would love to put the blame on someone in the executive branch, be it Biden or Trump or Bush or whomever, but really, this is the best answer. It was inevitable. History has taught us this: the Afghan terrain mixed with knowledge of terrain and how to manipulate, terrorize until they get what they want. The local population meant the Taliban could hide, work underground for years and simply resurface once the foreign militaries pulled out. Pretty sure everyone was a bit surprised it only took 2 weeks, but other than that, yeah, inevitable. Other than nuking the whole country, which no one is suggesting is a good idea, and starting over in 10 years, I've never heard a plan that I thought would remotely have a chance at working. As a Singaporean, I can't help but make comparisons to how Singapore was lost to Japan during WW2 because Imperial British could not defend us. We were a British colony at the time. It was one of the reasons why when Japan surrendered and British rule returned at the end of WW2, Singaporeans of that generation were adamant in pushing for independence afterwards, as we did not want to rely on the British afterwards. I'll do it on his behalf. I don't understand how it was even a shocker when it happened in Iraq. Pulled out of the country and they collapsed in on us hard, with Iceland trying to attack as much as they could because they knew everyone was rolling out. Afghanistan. I mean, it's not even a shocker who was in power at the time of the Iraq pullout, and now here we are again pulling out prematurely in another war and the exact same thing happened. Don't even worry about the politics and all that bullshit. This was a demos mistake and it shouldn't have ever happened. Your father was right to think this is literally Vietnam all over again. You'd think after 2-3 times we'd get our shit together and realize we can't just quit because it makes for a good headline. I had a classmate in my nursing program from Afghanistan. She was a wonderful person and had some horrible stories to tell about the Taliban. This was in 2012. She was so happy that things were safer. I think about her and her family right now and I feel so sad and worried for the people affected. I feel really awful for the servicemen and women who were there and risked their lives just to see this happen. I'm just really, really sad and heartbroken. World War II is often cited by many people as being the model, and it's not bad, but General Marshall's plan had one distinct feature: both Germany and Japan were industrial powers, and along with the rest of the industrialized world, were able to rebuild. Afghanistan was a marginal industrial state, but that was so long ago it clearly doesn't matter. The whole concept of nation-state doesn't really play here. Pashto, Harati, Tajik, Taliban, Sunni, Shia, all mixed, and sometimes in violent combination. And this is the major defect in not just the thinking of the United States, but in the thinking of every foreign interest that has come here to get their arrogance checked for the last couple of thousand years. So maybe, and I'm just spitballing here, we should take a hard and serious look at what we have. The Pashto and other tribes are resilient in a way that has endured every imperial ambition since antiquity, and so maybe it's worthwhile to ask these people what they want for themselves. Ask around, see what is agreeable to them. That's why the Taliban are so fucking successful here, is that they play to all the notional values that are attractive to the tribal powers that exist here. Those tribal powers aren't interested in perhaps any of the values of Western society, but they do have interests. The United States has a variety of good and virtuous things in its society, but not all of them translate at all. So take giving women rights or introducing programming and high-tech consumer society to individuals who might never earn in a decade enough money to buy a laptop or an iPhone. and far more unfathomable and disturbing to Western thinkers, is that these folks might have absolutely no interest in doing so, ever. So as the Taliban reasserts itself, it's a very dark time for Afghani young people and Afghani women in particular. What might be required for places like Afghanistan or Africa, or Indonesia, or interior China and India and every other place in the world, is to first listen very carefully to what the people in those places want. What are they interested in? And perhaps most importantly, what don't they care about? This forces us then to confront another serious concern, which is to wonder, what about women's rights, prisoner rights or child slavery or whatever other item that is of critical importance to folks in the Western world? What Afghanistan has taught us, if we are wise, is that there are real cultural limits to the virtues of Western society, not because the women and sympathetic culture of Afghanistan might not want those ideals, but rather that nobody took the time, the long, decades and decades-long time to slowly change the culture of the Afghani tribes, from the inside out, rather from the outside in. And we know that resisting outside-in change is something the Afghani people are perhaps supremely resistant to that sort of change. So if one fine day the elderly leader of some Pashto tribe emerges from her tribe's madrasa to head over to the tax office to discuss industrial credits for the new microprocessor plant in Herat, with the iTablet 45 with her digitally autographed copy of iProgramming in Linux as translated by one of the scholars at the school, we'll know it was because that Pashto tribes had chosen to embrace those changes, and not a moment before. I hate a lot of the rules about asylum. Refugees are required to accept refuge in the first safe country they pass through. When my great-grandmother fled Poland in the 1920s, she passed through Hungary on the way to America. With our current rules, she would have been required to stay in Hungary. For those unaware, the Hungarian Jews didn't fare much better than the Polish Jews. You would think we would learn from history and that our policies would become more humane over time, but it doesn't always work like that. That Afghanistan isn't some homogeneous or uniform country, where everyone will unite against Taliban. Some people will be staunchly pro-Taliban, others will be anti-Taliban. It's impossible for us Westerners to put ourselves in their shoes, which is unfortunately why bringing democracy to such countries is almost always a non-starter to begin with. Yes, I think it is unfortunate that hardcore fundamentalists will be able to control the daily lives of so many different people, but in all honesty, what can you do, without breaking up a country? Why is it that the fundamentalists can gain this much control over the people, if the people don't want to live like this? Why can't the people, with help from others, fight back to get to a life that they desire? And what is the end goal of the Taliban ownership over Afghanistan, when even within this group, there is constant infighting? I'm curious to get your thoughts, because your points are well thought out and I'd love to get opinions based on strong knowledge of the area. My ancestry is not too far from there, so I understand the cultures somewhat, but I still can't wrap my head around what the people want, desire, why they can't get to that point, and what the Taliban's end goal is. Because it feels like their goal is to kill every Afghani and then some. I read this comment on another thread and it sums it up for me. From all the news I've seen over the past several years, I thought the Taliban had been reduced to a few foot soldiers left hiding in caves. I thought that America's military presence in Afghanistan had bombed their assets, killed their leaders, and disrupted their command structure, and that Afghanistan was now having free and fair elections and its citizens were enjoying expanded rights under a new constitution. But in reality, the place was taken over by a force of like 75k Taliban in less than a week. What the fuck was afooly going on over there? It was shocking how quickly it happened, but not that shocking if you look closer at things. They did have some, mostly I think, fair elections, but I think the last one was heavily disputed, and then part of the problem was that American forces were doing all the heavy lifting to defend against the Taliban. The Afghan army was weak and many of its troops deserted but still existed on paper so that corrupt military officials could steal their wages. It was never a strong government. The Taliban were always lurking and ready to attack, They were just kept mostly confined to rural areas. Also, the human rights situation wasn't that great. Much better than under the Taliban, I guess. But that's a damn low bar. Exactly. You can't just roll in, force a civil war, and then expect to restabilize the country like that. I think, as Americans, we've both romanticized the idea of revolution and also underestimate how complicated civil wars can be. We're lucky that both of these events in our country only resulted in several years of full-scale war. But if you look at our civil war especially, the destabilization which both caused it and came after have lasted for the majority of our country's existence. It's absolutely arrogant to believe that we could unify a foreign nation when we still have people flying civil war flags at home. Whenever I hear Afghanistan news these days, I just remember the first days in my country Yemen when the rebels Houthis started to gain power. I think the same will happen in Afghanistan. The importance of Afghanistan to the Americans has vanished. I don't think USA will do anything there. All foreign representations will leave the country. If Taliban stayed in Afghanistan, they will rule eventually and the world will accept them. If they tried to invade Pakistani lands, which will probably happen in a year or so, there will be a regional, semi-international move to stop them and have embargo on Afghanistan. Iranian here. I don't care about countries pulling out troops. It's not their war and they shouldn't risk their own soldiers. What I'm disgusted by is just the lack of kinship from these countries. The people of Afghanistan need humanitarian aid right now. The Talibans are savage animals who torture people. There's videos surfacing of them stealing children as sex slaves and probably for human trafficking. It's all really the Afghan government's fault, but the people are the ones who will suffer the worst, and I think we have a responsibility as human beings to save each other in dire circumstances. I'm a disabled veteran because of my time spent in Afghanistan. It feels like it was for nothing. Though at the time it felt that way as well. All of us who actually were boots on the ground and interacting with the people there and training the Afghan army knew this was inevitable. Everything is still tribal there. There is no national pride or faith in government. The second we stepped off soil, their army was already preparing to go home because none of them are going to risk their necks for anyone but themselves. It's very sad because there are good people there that just want to live their lives that are now going to have to try and find somewhere else to go because the Taliban will kill them for any reason they want. My life was changed from my time overseas, and just thinking about how it all amounted to nothing is depressing. I can't work physical labor jobs. I have PTSD. I can hardly hear. And now those assholes not only took over again, but now they have some sweet new USA hardware to keep it. We should have gotten the people who wanted out before we pulled out. And we shouldn't have pulled during fighting season. We should have pulled out during the poppy harvest so there weren't so many people with nothing better to do than to take up arms. And the government has a chance before facing full-on warfare. This was inevitable and was what was going to happen ever since we invaded that country to find a Saudi who was in Pakistan. It's terrible, but we never should have invaded Afghanistan in the first place. And Biden is going to take the blame for this when it really belongs with Bush and his willingness to go kill people to look like he was doing something. It's the outcome of a series of poor decisions being made by many individuals in multiple countries. It seems to me that the immediate cause is that no one has any confidence that things could be made any better. The US, the Afghani government, the other world powers, and even the people on the ground seem to view everything with a certain sense of inevitability, which makes it inevitable because no one has any further willingness to fight against the likely outcome. It further demonstrates the inability of the current world powers to realize the long-held dream of creating an international order capable of aiding peoples all around the world and resolving international conflicts. This seems like a net negative for people's faith in governments. I think it's a bitter pill for the US to swallow, and I fear it'll lead to a period of American withdrawal from the world stage which is not being adequately compensated for by the other world powers. A lack of global consensus on the direction for the future bodes ill for the ordinary person who might suffer from increased international competition for power and prestige. Immediately, There will be a lot of suffering as power shifts hands in Afghanistan. I expect that various groups will try to make the best of this situation, and come up with right conclusions and overly simplistic lessons learned thanks to the benefit of hindsight. I expect the media to spend some time trying to figure out how to explain this to their respective audiences, and ultimately we'll end up with a few narratives about what went wrong which will focus on the big picture and try to tie everything to some broad generalizations about Afghanistan and its people and how this was doomed from the start because of their usual target of criticism. In another 10-20 years, someone will conclude that they fully understand how everything could have been done better and scoff at the old guard involved in this conflict. The global order will be different at that time, so new minds will come to the fore with new plans about how to improve the world. Then there will be another regional conflict that shares similarities, but is ultimately different in its nature. The cycle will repeat, as planners attempt to leverage the conflict to make the world a better place. What you described is a cycle of failure, and it's disgustingly depressing because of how likely it is to occur. The U.S. withdrawal is one thing, but other superpowers entering the fore will be another thing. The balance of power, whilst never actually equal, had a modicum of level to it. The failure in Afghanistan has probably just tipped the scales to where there is a power vacuum and everyone's looking to capitalize on it. I don't think the suffering will stop to just being immediate either. To think about it is depressing, which is probably why most people just gloss over it and ignore it. Sad. So, I've seen a lot of Afghanis need to just take control of this themselves, and I even saw replies like "this is your fault and your responsibility" on Facebook to a lovely young woman who identified as being an Afghani refugee. I want to share a quick experience I had that made me think about what it feels like to be powerless. I moved to the Middle East this year from a Western country. I know Afghanistan is not technically in the Middle East, it's in Central Asia, but that's not important for this story. I came in as a white, relatively privileged woman during a low-COVID period, but I was on one of the first flights into the country, which had been on totally national lockdown for months. No one in or out. The airport was literally lined with military with extremely large guns that were in hands or slung over shoulders. We were kept on the plane for hours, then finally let out into a secure area for a few more hours while we had rapid tests performed. During this time, we had no access to food or water. We were told where to go and what to do, and there was a lot of yelling and a lot of tension. Then after hours we finally were able to go through customs and were immediately loaded into buses based on pre-booked quarantine hotel locations and slips of paper that we couldn't read as they were in Arabic. We got on our designated bus, and then after a few minutes, a man came in and yelled at us to leave and get on other bus. We knew it was the wrong bus, but they had big guns, so we didn't argue. We were taken to the wrong quarantine location. Then, despite my husband and I coming on the same flight, being booked at the same quarantine hotel, 2 military men came to the hotel and separated us. They put me in a cab alone and took me separately to a different location. It was going on 9 hours of no food and no water, and several hours at that point of no access to a bathroom. We did manage to find each other again at the new quarantine location, but all the incoming people had to wait outside the hotel for another 2 hours as they logged people in. The hotel was blockaded off with military as well. It took 11 hours before we got in and got water, and another hour or so before we got food. Now, during this whole experience, I was still relatively safe. It's a friendly country and most of this was just disorganization and big guns, which are scary. But during the whole process I realized just how utterly powerless I was and how just a few hours without food and water, like literally not having it and not knowing where you can get it, can make you weak and scared. So imagine people who have been living under that kind of powerlessness for years, or decades, or their entire lives. Imagine a group of armed, angry men who have a long history of not treating people kindly and who have very little incentive not to kill, torture, or rape you swarming into your city. It's so totally unfair when people just flippantly say, well, it's their problem now, because it's not. It's not just their problem, because a lot of the people whose burden it has become are women, children, frightened, hungry, powerless people who have had no agency their whole lives because men with big guns are right there, and then also neighbors who can't wait to take advantage of the powerless are also right there. So who can you trust? My heart breaks for people there.